There's a name for Viktor Orban's system of government. He calls it illiberal democracy. It's basically the primacy of populist nationalism over individual freedoms.
On the campaign trail, Italy's new interior minister used hardline rhetoric to fire up the voters.
Fake, disgusting news.
This was a direct act by the Russian state against our country.
She's loved. We love her, right? We love her. That was wonderful. Did you bask in that moment? That's lovely. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Heather Reisman, and I am so beyond delighted to be here today on stage with these two extraordinary, erudite women to talk about populism and strong men in the world, only not strong men, strong men. And I think it's quite fabulous that we have two fabulous, strong women to talk about strongmen. So let's get into it, because we have a short time for a subject that I know on my part I could spend an entire day listening to both of you. Just as a quickie to connect where most people's heads probably are right now, listening to the news endlessly about Mueller and the Russian probe and Trump and Russia and Putin and Trump. It is like, actually, Putin's running the place. He's got complete control over what's going on, and the rest of those people living in the United States and all of us watching the US are just seeing him play out a script that he wanted written. And I just thought, Masha, it would be wonderful. And in fact, Chrystia, jump in at any time. Like I'll direct them one way, but interrupt me, go right for it. So
just sum up the whole Russia thing in a
minute. The
Okay.
entire thing, listen, we only have 30 minutes. but from your thoughtful perspective, how do you make sense of what you hear?
Right. I think a couple of things. First of all, we have to be mindful of what we don't know. And there's still a whole lot that we don't know. And I think we also, as a journalist, I'm also mindful of the information that we do get, which we get from American law enforcement, and in particular from the FBI and the Special Prosecutor's Office, or the Special Investigators, where we are not going to get a full picture. We're getting a fairly controlled narrative. That narrative right now tends toward Russia's interference influenced the outcome of the election, but we have seen no evidence of that. And I think that it's incredibly tempting to believe that story fully, and to place onto it, sort of the extent of our outrage and horror at what has happened. Because when the unimaginable happens, we want to have a simple explanation. And Russia is a very simple explanation. I think that things are not quite so simple. I think that Russian interference was the continuation of something that Russia has been doing for many decades. And the reason that there's a deep reason why it suddenly, after all these decades, tapped into something that was happening in the United States. And in the end, what we're going to be left with is that 62 million Americans, whether they were influenced by something false or not, 62 million Americans who had not been robbed of their free will in their agency, made the choice to vote for Donald Trump. We're still stuck with that.
But I am going to just push this a tiny bit, a two-part. In your view, is there going to be much there?
The answer is, I don't know.
Okay.
We're going to find out when we find out.
And even if there is a there, to what extent is that, and I understand that you can't, but you have some view. In the end, you see we still have Trump.
Right, exactly. The there that they're looking for is not going to explain away Trump. It's not going to make him magically disappear. It's not going to reassure us that he came from outer space, or at least from Russia. He came from the United States, and he was voted into office by Americans.
Okay, and I think that's the interesting point to excavate. How is it that we're getting this kind of populism, a different brand in different places? Chrystia, let me just ask, it does seem wherever we look, Hungary, Austria, Turkey, Russia, Israel in its way, of course, part of the Middle East always has it, United States, we do see this kind of populist movement with somewhat different complexion depending on the history, but it's mushrooming. It feels like it's metastasizing in some way. What's your view about how contagious this is, and what's at the root of it?
Another really easy question to answer concisely, Heather, so thank you. And I hope you'll let me, Heather, just for 1 minute, say a couple of general things, which is, welcome everybody. I'm Canada's Minister of Foreign Affairs. My name is Chrystia Freehand, and I'm also the Member of Parliament for University Rosedale. So we are now in my riding, and isn't it a great riding? And yeah. And I'm especially happy that we're here at the Royal Conservatory, which is a great Canadian cultural institution, and University Rosedale is really, really proud to have it here. I think all of us who are Canadians and tried to learn music remember those Royal Conservatory piano books. I struggled with them, and
cover.
One of my kids is learning how to play violin here, so it's a great place to be. We are on the traditional lands of the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation, and I think it's important to acknowledge that. Et au fin, c'est un très grand plaisir d'être ici avec vous, surtout avec les femmes canadiennes, et l'appui, votre appui est très, très important pour moi. Merci beaucoup. On the point about authoritarianism, Heather, since Masha is here, I'll start with a Tolstoy quote, which is that great first line of Anna Karenina, that all happy families are alike and unhappy families are unique in their unhappiness. And it's kind of true about countries whose politics is going sour. I think you're absolutely right that there is this broader worrying trend in the world. It's important, I think, for every country to look to the specifics of what's happening in your own country. And I certainly feel, I am so proud to be Canadian. Our country is really amazing, and now more than ever. But our Prime Minister, who I think people heard earlier today, has this great thing that he tells us sometimes in cabinet, which is Canada didn't happen by accident, and it won't continue without intentional effort. And to sort of turn your question upside down, I think people who believe in liberal democracy, people who believe that a multicultural society can actually be really successful and happy and prosperous, people who believe in the multilateral rules-based order, and I'm a person who believes in all three of those things, we have to not take them for granted. And we have to really double down on those values. We have to think about what are the issues, the concerns, the anxieties in the 21st century that could make people turn back on those values, and try hard to address them.
Actually, I think just interesting as someone who spends a lot of time welcoming good authors, this is a point you might both know that Timothy Snyder has made in his book about, so good that you remind us that we need to appreciate democracy. It's not guaranteed. And I know, Masha, you have some point of view about that, about the characteristics of democracy and how they're different under different circumstances. I'd like to amplify where you're taking us here, Chrystia, a little bit more. on this notion, are we just, does it feel like this is this terrible moment and democracy is just at risk and teetering and we, this bad thing is going to happen? Do you see it just kind of as a moment and we should all stop hyperventilating and just assume it's going to get better? Or do you feel some legitimate concern? And if so, what do we do with this concern?
So two things. I think the theme for me today is we don't know, right? And first of all, we don't know what democracy is, right? Democracy is not a set of mechanisms. Democracy is a set of aspirations. Democracy always lives in the imagination, right? Democracy is always something that we're trying to create. We're trying to create a way of governing by the people who are being governed. It is never going to be perfect. It is never going to be completed. And so I think that it's not just intentional. It's never complete, right? We're always building it. There isn't actually never a moment when we can say, okay, things are going to be just fine. Sit back and relax. Because if we don't build democracy, it doesn't happen. And as for this particular moment, I think we're in grave danger, right? And that doesn't mean that something absolutely horrible is going to happen, although horrible things are happening all over the world. But it doesn't mean we're going to see a repeat of the disasters of the 20th century. But if we don't hyperventilate, if we don't act, we'll find out when we have failed. And if we do act, we'll never find out when we prevent it.
Right. So this notion of acting or engaging or understanding, I think that is an idea that we want to explore and explore for the audience, because what does it mean to get engaged? Since, and let me just set this up, and Chrystia, you can start, and both of you, since at some level the engagement that seems most discernible that we can witness feels like it's at the extremes in so many cases. Extreme left, extreme right. And that in itself seems to be a threat to what feels like the basic notion of democracy, the most good for the most people, but with individual free will to decide. So what is it we're seeing in the participation that we are observing or experiencing? Does it feel like it's extreme?
I mean, Heather, the way I would start by responding to that is I can't resist quoting that great Yeats line. The best lack all conviction, the worst are full of passionate intensity. And if I were still a newspaper editor, I wouldn't let anybody write that line in their columns because it's being quoted so much, because it feels so appropriate to this moment. But I think we don't have to let it be appropriate to the moment, right? We all have agency. We're all people who can do things. Everyone who's here, you've chosen to spend your Monday afternoon listening to these, I hope, interesting conversations. And I really believe the answer is to be active yourself. I really like the line that democracy is not a noun, it's a verb. If we want to live in a liberal democracy, we can't assume that other people will make it exist and act and function for us. We have to take responsibility and be involved and be engaged. And, I think that is, we have to kind of fight back for liberal democracy right now. And, I want to sound the opposite of complacent, because I think that Masha was right to say we kind of have to be a little anxious right now. But one of the things that I certainly feel among Canadians is that a lot of Canadians get that. A lot of people are saying, you know what? I want to live in a liberal democracy. I want to live in a diverse society. I want to live in a world where might does not make right, where we have a rules-based order. And I actually feel that people are getting more active and more engaged than maybe we were a decade ago.
Yeah, we hope that's true and not at the extremes. Let's talk a little of a bit about the autocratic leaders in those countries where democracy is not a tradition. Because I think two separate things, right? This populism in countries with a democratic tradition, one thing, without a democratic tradition, something else. Masha, there is this sense that autocrats, the true autocrats, peddle this fantasy that they have this strong, unequivocal, decisive leadership, and there's something resonating in that strong leadership, maybe on both sides, democracies and not. Why is that? It seems that that's so seductive right now. You talk about agency, that people want to give up some of their agency. Can you share a bit, like, why is it so seductive? Why do people in Russia love Putin?
Well, actually, we don't know if they love Putin.
Yeah.
I mean, in
those
a country,
elections.
in a country with
Right.
no public and no
Right.
opinion, you can't measure public opinion, right? In a country where the president totally controls the media and has eliminated the public sphere as such, we can't actually know what people are thinking. But I want to very quickly, though, answer to the previous question, which is, I live in the United States, so I think that what is often called the extreme left in the United States would be called the moderate right in most normal countries of the world. So I kind of, from my point of view, there's in that question there's more of a false equivalency than there is of an actual issue, right? But as for autocrats and their appeal, the great social psychologist Erich Fromm wrote a book called Escape from Freedom. I highly recommend it. It's a very slim book. It's extremely readable, and I think it's amazingly illuminating. In the introduction to the book, he actually apologizes for writing it so hastily. He says it's a little sloppy because he was in a hurry, because he felt that the world is on the verge of catastrophe. That introduction is written in 1940. Right? But in the book, he proposes that there are certain times in human history when people, that there are two kinds of freedom. There's freedom from and freedom to. Freedom from is we all want our parents to stop telling us what to do. We all want the freedom from. Freedom to is the freedom to act, the freedom to invent your future. And it's a grave responsibility, and sometimes it gets to be too much. And when the future is truly uncertain, when people feel destabilized, when a critical mass of people feel like they don't know what's going to happen, then they will reach for what he calls the magic helper. The magic helper, who is the populist leader who traffics in the appeal of the imaginary past, and who says, okay, you can give over your agency, you can relieve yourself of this unbearable burden of freedom, and I'll tell you what to do. And I think that appeal is universal, right?
Yeah.
For people who feel like they don't know what their future is. I think that the difference between countries with a tradition of democracy and countries without it is what can be done with it, right? And what we can also do to oppose this appeal of the imaginary past. And I think that creating a vision of the future, and creating a vision of the future that is created, in the commons, that is created by people together, which is what politics really is. That's something that countries with a tradition of democracy are in a position to do.
Can I just build on what Masha said, Heather? Is that okay? So I think those are excellent points, Masha, and I would just like to build on your uncertainty point, because I really believe that particularly in sort of the industrialized West, this concern about the future and sense of uncertainty about the future, particularly when it comes to the economy, is extremely powerful. And it's real. It's not sort of a fake concern. People are worried because there's something to worry about. I was recently talking with the CEO of a big Canadian transport company, and I won't name him because I didn't tell him that I would mention his story today. And he was talking to me about how they have a big shortage of truck drivers. And the reason they have a shortage of truck drivers is no one wants to train to be a truck driver now because people see automation coming. So imagine if you're my age, I turned 50 this summer, and it was okay. I survived. Imagine if you're my age and you're a truck driver. My uncle was a truck driver. And, you're a truck driver, and you see this wave of automation coming. And you think to yourself, like, will my job last long enough for me to retire? That is not some kind of amorphous anxiety. That is very real economic anxiety. And I think in a lot of Western industrialized democracies, that anxiety has come on top of very real lived failure of capitalist democracy, right? It has come on top of the 2008 financial crisis. It has come on top of median wage stagnation for decades. And so I think that there is, nothing that mysterious about people saying, you know what? This system, which was supposed to deliver security for me, opportunities for my children, one, hasn't been doing such a great job for the past 20 years, and two, doesn't seem to have a plan for how the next 20 or 30
Wow,
years are gonna work.
this could be a discussion for an entire day, really, the extent to which the capitalist system has not delivered or has warped certain things, or the division of wealth, the crazy amount of wealth at the top, and what the capitalist system has done, which is good. And I must say, it worries me, these kinds of discussions that don't get enough exposure. That is, I would like to see them have more exposure, because I think people could jump to conclusions. And it gets me to my next question, based on some research I saw, and you didn't even get to answer the second part, and I knew 30 minutes wasn't going to be enough here. But I was reading some research recently that millennials, a bigger number of people in that cohort than ever, are questioning whether or not democracy and the capitalist system that underpins it is of value. And even if that's only 15 or 18% of the people, that's a lot of people. So you're clearly right, but there's a whole lot to excavate there. I mean, right.
Like, for example, why the question is posed that way? Why we're having why we have linked democracy and capitalism as though they're inextricable?
Well, aren't they?
No.
Aren't they?
No.
Okay. Well, that's I'm open to learning, which I think is why we're all here. But I would say that the everything that I have read, learned so far, which is clearly not as much as you have, but that would be an interesting debate, whether or not capitalism, so it isn't succeeding the way it should, but has it caused boats to rise more over the last period of time? But that's bigger than we have a discussion for today, but it would be such a rich discussion, and I'm sure I could learn a ton and hopefully add something to the discussion. But I want to get to two other questions before we're over. The immigration issue, which is so significant and which feels so much like it needs to be addressed, and the more tyrannical leaders, whether in democratic countries or not, seem the most unlikely to embrace, understand, have empathy for those who have become immigrants, often fleeing the most ridiculous circumstances. You've been incredible. Can you each comment a little bit? We're left with 2 minutes, and I've got 1,000, but would you each comment on just your thoughts on how are we going to address this immigrant legitimate opportunity with the current leadership in so many countries?
Okay, I'll say 2 points really quickly because we don't have a lot of time. I just want to start, and it does have an immigrant connection, Heather, with this economic point we were making.
Yeah.
And I want to be clear. Like, I think a market economy is the best way people have figured out how to run economies so far. But I think that if we are worried, and I think we should be, about liberal democracy, we have to be really worried about how people in the middle class and people working hard in the middle class fare. And if we don't address that very legitimate economic insecurity, all our other values are going to be in jeopardy. And I think it is very much connected with the anti-immigrant sentiment we're seeing in a lot of places. Because I think when people feel insecure about their lives, it goes back to Masha's point about looking for magical solutions, looking for magical leaders, and looking for magical enemies. And it's always easiest to blame the other. It's easiest to blame the other country. It's easiest to blame the person who has just arrived. And, I obviously think that's not right. And, knock on wood, we seem in Canada still to have a strong public consensus around the value to our country of being welcoming to immigrants. And it's great, isn't it?
I want to.
And
Chrystia,
I'll say one sentence,
wanna
Heather,
give
super fast.
Masha
Can I just say one
second
sentence
on
really
that?
fast?
Sure,
Okay. And so, why is that a good thing? One, for me, it's consistent with my values. I love living in our super diverse city of Toronto. You may not know, Masha, 50% of the people in Toronto are born outside Canada. Wow. Isn't that amazing? But it's also a huge competitive advantage for our country. We are going to be a country which can continue to grow, can continue to thrive, partly because we remain an open society. And I think that's great.
And I agree with you, by the way, that we need to deal with not just the middle, but the bottom. But go.
Very, very quickly. I'm just going to skip the problem and go immediately to the solution.
Right.
I think we have to stop allowing ourselves to be. We have to stop allowing hate to frame the immigration debate, which we in the United States are really stuck in. And the counter argument has to be much bigger than the immigrants are good for the economy or immigrants are good people. The counter argument has to be based on non-immigrants being good people. We have to be open. We have to have our country open to other people, not because they are good, but because we are good. Because that is a basic attribute of humanity. So.
That's excellent.
I have to say we couldn't end on a note that is more joyous, because this is at its core, isn't it, about our basic humanity and our empathy and our ability to approach life that way. Thank you both so much. Chrystia, especially in the midst of what you're in. Masha, you have to come back to Canada, because this is an audience and a country, I think, that really wants to learn from you.
And thank you, Heather.
So much.
Great job.
Okay.